This is our first ever.
Sorry.
As Linton says, our first ever, and we hope our only Zoom meeting. So it falls to me to introduce Judy, and one of these little boxes on my screen is Judy. I hope she hasn't run away. Oh, there she is. She's on top right on my screen, and she'll be full screen shortly. So Judy has been involved for many years, which is hard to believe because she's quite a young lady, but for many years she's been involved in climate change policy and practice, and she's presently a senior research fellow in the New Zealand Climate Research Institute at Victoria University, and also a director of PS Consulting. In her personal life, Judy lives in the Eastern Bays, which she insists is not part of Wellington, but somewhere around Eastbourne, Days Bay, that part of the world. Lives with her husband there, and they have two grown-up sons, one of whom is an electrician and one is a mathematician. So Judy, we're delighted to have you with us in a virtual sense, and welcome, and the floor is yours. Oh, sorry, the screen is yours.
Kia ora tātou, and ngā mihi haere mai, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you tonight, and I'm delighted to be your first Zoom for your meeting. So I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Right. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is really the gap between our greenhouse gas emissions and, excuse me, the need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And you will have heard quite a lot about greenhouse gas emissions and a lot of talk about reducing them and how important it is. And I want to stress that at the beginning. And also the mirror of the emissions is to adapt to the impacts. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a quick outline of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to briefly talk to you about what drives the urgency to reduce our emissions and to adapt to climate change, what the risks are globally and what they are for New Zealand. And I have a little surprise for you. There'll be some very specific risks shown for the Wairarapa. Also, I'm going to talk about this link between mitigation and adaptation, and then finally, what can we do about it? But first, I just want to inform you about this Climate Change 2021, which came out a couple of months ago. And it's the first in a series of 3 intergovernmental panel on climate change assessments. Now we're up to the 6th and we've got to crunch time. And I'm part of the next report that's coming out, and I've been slaving away for the last 2.5 years on that, and round the clock in the last 2 weeks. So it's very fresh, and that won't be available until about March next year is when the second report, followed fairly quickly by the third report, which is about how to reduce your emissions. The second one is about the impacts. And this report, which just came out, had this comment was made that unless there are immediate and rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. And the international agreement is to make best efforts to get to 1.5, but definitely to get to 2 degrees as a sort of 1.5 is really a guardrail, if you like. So this is part of the urgency. Now, for those who are not familiar with what is happening, the human influence on climate change is unequivocal. And as you can see, the bottom blue line that goes out to the right is if you projected out the impact, if we were dealing just with natural variability and natural climate change. And what we're observing now is, along with the human and the natural factors, the line is going up very, very quickly and has gone up quite quickly on our watch. So for the last 20 or 30 years, this line's been climbing. And they now have what we call attribution studies, which can show that this line would not have moved up unless there had been human influence determining it. And there are multiple drivers, climate impact drivers, that are projected to change in all regions of the world. So we're now observing this everywhere. So that's the bad news. And this is how it impacts. Now, I'm not sure whether you can, I hope you can see this. Is it full screen enough to read? But the left-hand one is basically showing you what the frequency of, as the temperatures go up, what additional, how likely we are to get 4.5 times, 8.6 times the frequency of different climate drivers. And so what we're seeing is, as the temperatures go up, we're seeing a greater frequency of climate events of one sort or another, whether it's temperature, whether it's rainfall, etc. So the one on the right, the blue one, is the increase in extreme rainfall. And it shows that at present, we're at about 1.09 degrees, 1.1 degrees already. And we're 6.7% wetter than we were back in the period 1850 to 1900. And as we go out, as the temperature warms, we increase by 10.5%, 14%, and up to 30% wetter. So as we near 4 degrees, which we hope we will never get to, we can be 30% wetter. So it just gives you an idea of what's happening globally. Now, the one at the bottom is about sea level rise relative to 1900. And it was observed back around the time, about the 1970s, 80s, sort of around that period. And the bands that are going up are showing different possible scenarios of the future. Okay, so if we have a future with intense fossil fuel rise, the top line is where we will end up. And if we have one that's based on more of a sustainable activities, which will lead us out to a lower trajectory. And so the top one is almost at 1 metre sea level rise, and the bottom one is at roughly 0.5, 0.6 of a metre of sea level rise. Now, there's two important things in this message. One is that in some places, and one very close to me in Petone, we only need about 30 centimetres of sea level rise before we have to make decisions about putting in a pumped stormwater system, because the gravity system won't work, okay? And that will happen in many low-lying places around New Zealand. So that's one message, that we actually need to get cracking now and think about what the future of our cities are going to look like. Now, this other dotted line is the first time the IPCC has shown this one, and it is unlikely, but it's not, cannot be ruled out. It's a high impact rise under a future with intensive fossil fuel use and ice sheet instability. And we're already seeing ice sheet instability in both Greenland and in the Western Antarctic peninsula, which is warming quite rapidly. And so while it's not going to suddenly collapse, there will come a time when tipping points will be reached, and we don't quite know when those are at the moment, but there's a lot of work going on, particularly at Victoria University on this, at the Antarctic Research Group. And so these are just some examples of what is potentially going to happen. So we now have a little song and dance. Linton's going to talk in a minute, give us a little bit of an overview of what will happen in your neck of the woods. But before we do that, I just sort of put up the global picture, which is really from this 2020-21 report, that the recent changes are widespread, rapid, intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years, okay? Hundreds of thousands of years, actually. Climate change is already affecting every region of the Earth and in multiple ways, and the changes we're experiencing will increase with further warming unless we bend the curve and reduce the warming. And it's indisputable that the human activities are causing this, and they're making extreme events extremer, and heat waves, heavy rainfall, droughts are more frequent and more severe than they were in the last lots of reports that have been produced by the IPCC. And we have seen that there's no going back for some changes in the climate system. And however, some changes can be slowed and others can be stopped. So we've got a range of things we can control and some we can't. And to limit global warming, that we need strong, rapid and sustained reductions in both carbon dioxide, methane and other greenhouse gases, and they all are necessary. This would not only reduce the consequences of climate change, but it also has the benefit of improving air quality. Now, New Zealand has also looked at its risks, and last year it produced the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, and I was part of that team. And these are the types of domains that were set out in the, oops, I'll just go back. All these areas were covered in the risk report. And these are the top risks, if you like, in the first 5 domains. So the top 10 risks were coastal ecosystems were affected by sea level rise and extreme weather events, and natural ecosystems and species from invasive animals and pests and weeds. And then the human one was social cohesion, well-being and inequities were at risk. In other words, inequities that would be made worse across the human domain. The economic costs and financial instability were identified as the key economic gain risks. And probably no surprise, the built environment, potable water supplies and buildings were the most at risk around the country. Now, interestingly, we had this governance domain, which I was responsible for, and this looked at whether or not we're prepared in the way in which we make decisions. The inadequate legislation, practices and processes were identified as being creating risks for decision makers, and also the ability to fund and coordinate across levels of government are at risk if we don't do this properly. And another new area was identifying that there are now many cascading and compounding impacts, and some of those are beyond New Zealand. One good example that we received and were the ash from the Australian wildfires a couple of summers ago. And so those sorts of issues are now happening with more frequency around the world, and the resources needed to deal with them are in competition because the fire seasons are overlapping. And that's something that will be of interest to you in the Wairarapa, because you're in a dry part of New Zealand, and where fire risk is probably one of the issues specifically. Now, this is just a visual that some of you may have seen back in 2019 that was produced by local government New Zealand, and it shows what is exposed from sea level rise and at different levels of sea level rise. So for 50 centimetres, it's the light blue in the front of this diagram, going through to 1 metre is the orange, 1.5 is the green or grey-green, and the 3 metres sea level rise is the bluey-green, bluey-grey one. And so you can see immediately that the Greater Wellington region is the 4th block along here. And you can see that there's actually a big jump when you go from 1.5 metres of sea level rise to 3 metres. And you can broadly see where the main areas that are at risk. You've got Auckland, Bay of Plenty, Canterbury and Wellington and Hawke's Bay are probably the most affected. And some in the Otago region and Northland particularly, and Nelson. And they all become quite significant at different sea level rises. And that's largely topographic, but it's also related to the assets that are at risk, how many people are there and so on. So that just gives you a little bit of a snapshot of, you know, where the affected areas are from sea level rise specifically. Right, Linton, can you do your magic? And we're going to show you a very short clip of a video that was released today by the Greater Wellington Regional Council, in which they suggested I might like to show this evening. So do I have to get out of this, don't I?
Probably, yeah, unshare it, yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Okay. Share screen. Right.
Hope it works.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to pause. No, can I pause that?
Yeah. Now, NIWA did this work for the Greater Wellington Regional Council to look at what the climate change projections were for the Wairarapa. So it was a bit of serendipity, really. Off you go.
Kia ora, I'm NIWA climate scientist Ngāwa Whadaiff. From large forestry blocks through productive farmlands to extensive horticulture and viticulture sectors, the Wairarapa is largely dependent on working with the natural environment. So, as we head into the future, it is critical to understand how our environment might change further so we can prepare, find opportunities, adapt, and continue to prosper. Climate change is already happening in the Wairarapa. In Masterton, the average temperature is currently about 1 degree higher than 100 years ago. This recent warming has been caused by an increase in greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere. These extra gas molecules cause more of the sun's radiation and heat to be pushed back down to Earth rather than escaping into space. Further changes to temperature and rainfall patterns, as well as sea level rise, are projected to have impacts on our communities, businesses, and natural environments. When talking about potential climate futures in this video, we focus on two different scenarios of greenhouse gas concentrations. One is a high-range scenario where atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise unabated. The other is a mid-range scenario where concentrations stabilise around 2060. Given we do not know which scenario will eventuate, it's important to explore the potential changes and impacts associated with both, so we can fully understand and explore the risks. Even with our efforts to reduce emissions locally and worldwide, we are still likely to see continued climate change and its associated impacts into the future. The warming we have seen over the past century in the Wairarapa is expected to continue, resulting in considerably more growing degree days. Growing degree day units can be used to assess the suitability of a region for a particular crop. Many industries, from viticulture through to horticulture, rely on specific temperature windows for their success. By the end of the 21st century, increases of 400 to 900 growing degree days are projected under the upper range scenario. This would see parts of the Wairarapa observing growing degree day totals comparable to those observed in parts of Northland. And this could have significant impacts for many key industries, so understanding these numbers can help us adapt to changing economic opportunities. By 2090, for the Wairarapa as a whole, maximum daytime temperatures are projected to be about 1.5 degrees warmer than present for the mid-range scenario seen here, but by 2.5 to 4 degrees warmer for the upper range scenario. Because the Wairarapa encompasses rugged mountains to vast plains, some areas warm more than others. Temperature increases are going to impact water supplies and demand for water, encourage the spread of pests, and place pressure on key growth stages of many crops. However, increased temperatures also provide opportunities for new warmer climate crops to be grown in the area. Increasing maximum temperatures also mean that extreme heat will be more common. The Wairarapa currently experiences up to 40 hot days per year, and this is projected to increase by up to 20 days by the middle of the 20th century under the mid-range scenario, and increase by up to 30 days by the end of the century seen here. If we place this projection next to the high range scenario, we can see how great the difference is, and at the end of the century for the high range scenario, there is a projected increase of up to 70 hot days per year. There is a large variation in the number of hot days across the region, with more in the low elevation areas. The increase in hot days is likely to place increased heat stress on livestock, contribute to a loss of biodiversity, and lead to increased energy use for cooling. Minimum temperatures are also projected to increase, which will result in fewer frost days for the Wairarapa. Frosts are more common for inland and high elevation areas of the region, but by the end of the century, up to 15 fewer frost days are expected under the mid-range scenario, with up to 35 fewer frost days under the high-range scenario. Because of our warming atmosphere, extreme rain events are likely to increase. This is because a warmer atmosphere can hold more energy and moisture. So when it rains heavily, more rain may fall than at present. Projected changes to rainfall are varied in the Wairarapa. While rainfall amounts during extreme events are expected to increase, average seasonal rainfall is projected to decrease for some areas by the end of the century under the mid-range scenario, with up to 8% less rainfall in autumn, winter and spring. Less rainfall in non-winter seasons combined with increased evapotranspiration from warmer temperatures means that drought is expected to be more common and more severe. This will impact access to reliable water supplies for towns, agriculture, horticulture and the natural environment. Importantly, the first 3 months of the year will likely be more vulnerable to droughts. The NEMA report contains projections for many more climatic variables than discussed here. The Greater Wellington Regional Council is hoping that open communication of the science in these projections will both motivate and inform discussions with tangata whenua, businesses and the wider community. With everyone working together, we can build resilience and collectively adapt to climate change.
Good, Judy, back to you now. Judy, if you're there, yeah. Oh, there you go. No.
Kia ora and welcome to the Island Climate Update for August through to October. During July, the tropical Pacific remained an ENSO neutral.
Oh, here we go. You just need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Can you hear me? I can't hear you though.
Yep, you're good now.
Oh, you're good now. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, you can. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, well, that gives you a little bit of a taste for what some of the impacts are specific to the Wairarapa. And as the presenter said, this is going to mean that we all need to work together and we need to develop some sort of a plan for the future. And what I want to just talk about now briefly is, can you see that? It's not in full screen. Is that better? Good.
Excellent.
Yeah, okay. The question you probably have at the end of that video is, well, how is climate change being addressed at the moment? And there's been quite a lot of activity in the last, really, 3 years. We've had a climate change technical working group which made a number of recommendations about the need for a national adaptation plan, the risk assessment, and for some means of monitoring progress for adaptation. And this little diagram here is one of the recommendations of the technical working group. The bits in the centre are all underway. Okay, we have a risk assessment done, the National Adaptation Plan is being prepared by the government, and we have a climate commission that was set up to do a number of things, including monitoring of the government's adaptation plan. And at the same time, this Climate Change Response Act was introduced, which set statutory targets in legislation for New Zealand to meet, and a mandate for the Climate Commission to give independent advice on a number of matters, including developing emission budgets, which are shown underneath at the bottom there, over several periods, and it produced those budgets, first 3 budgets in May, June period. And the government is now in the process of developing an emissions reduction plan based on that. And it is the Commission's role to monitor the progress of that as well, and to do the next risk assessment, as well as advising on the emissions trading system settings and progress on agriculture sector climate change commitments. And those aspects are currently underway at the moment. At the same time, the government announced that it was reforming the RMA, and it was going to include climate change within that. And it's proposing to set up a Strategic Planning Act and a Climate Change Adaptation Act. The first one, the Strategic Planning Act, is to set out high-level spatial planning that can deal with spatial issues that can help identify suitability of activities in a spatial sense, and particularly to avoid hazards and climate change risk. It's setting up some sort of funding arrangements, and we're yet to see what these are, that could fund adaptation. And it's also looking at how we deal with coastal risk, and in particular, how communities can be relocated or retreated from the coast, and how we deal with existing property, existing uses of property owners at the coast with an advancing sea. Now, as you can imagine, these are quite vexed and complex issues, but they are on the agenda. And this is sort of a brief overview of the things that are happening currently. So what does this mean? The nature of this problem we have is that, and these are some of the things that a couple of scientists said at the when the 2021 report from the IPCC was released. And the first one was optimistic, that if the world can substantially reduce emissions by 2020 and get to net zero emissions by around 2050, temperature rise can be limited to 1.5 degrees, but we need to act now. So this is the urgency that we're hearing from the scientific community. And another scientist said that many changes, such as ice loss and sea level rise, are irreversible for centuries or millennia. So even if we succeed in stabilising global temperature, we will need to adapt to ongoing changes for some time to come. So even though we bend the curve on emissions, there is a built-in inertia in the systems, the biophysical systems and the atmospheric systems, that means that the the oceans will continue to expand, and the ice sheets will also continue to respond to the warming signal. So it may be a slow process to get going, but once it gets going, it's very hard to turn around. So the burden we have for adaptation is that these impacts will continue even with reductions, and you heard that from the Niwa woman, that the risks are actually foreseeable. We know that they're going to happen. We just don't know exactly the scale and timing of all of it. They're ongoing and they will change. And so some are uncertain as to rate and scale, but some are not. So the failure to mitigate is going to increasingly reduce the space for adaptation, our ability to adapt. And our underinvestment in infrastructure is one of these risky issues, because a lot of it is in at-risk locations around the country. It's often on low-lying coastal roads. Our roads are low-lying. We can only just look at the Coromandel roads and how often they get affected and are disrupting communities on an ongoing and potentially more frequent basis. So it's actually increasing the burden, and that has a high cost of not acting. But we shouldn't kid ourselves either that the costs of acting are going to be lower. There'll be lower costs potentially, but they will still be costly, and we need to find ways to deal with those. And this notion of having compounding and cascading impacts has quite significant implications for a country like New Zealand, because it's complicated by the fact that we have local and global supply chains that get affected. And we see that. We see that when we have floods, and we see that when we have roads cut off and product can't get to market, and we get caught up in global supply chain issues, which of course COVID has given us a taste of what that means for a country. And so in a way is a very strong analogue for what we have coming down the pipe. So the challenges are that our decision frameworks and tools have to be built, that what we've been doing to date, we've been making decisions in a relatively benign climate conditions and getting relatively infrequent extreme events, although I think we all can see that these are happening more frequently, or that when the rain falls, it's a lot more intense than it was, even 30, 40 years ago. The extremes are becoming more frequent, and the seas are going to continue to rise. And because we make decisions now for assets and people, which last a long time, it's not just 100 years, it's well into the next century. We're making investments today. So we better make sure that they're in places that can continue to be used or adapted over time. And as humans, we expect to be able to turn the tap on and get water out, and we expect to have our roads accessible most of the time. But increasingly, these services are going to be impacted. And so we're going to have to modify our expectations, or really think seriously about how we're going to address these issues in a way that we don't leave people behind. And because different groups are going to be affected quite differently, and their needs will be greater. And again, I will draw the analogy with the COVID, what's happening in New Zealand with COVID. We're actually revealing some of these vulnerabilities in the system. And one of the other things is that we tend to work in silos as though the world hasn't changed. And so one of the issues really is to be working much more in a joined up way. So we need a bit of hope. So what can we do about this? One of the things that's growing in the international arena, with a number of reports that have come out only in the last year really, is that we need to be addressing climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution together for human well-being and planetary health. And the United Nations Environment Programme have been very clear about this, and so has the IPCC. And so there's a coming together over issues that need to be dealt with together and looking at the co-benefits between them. there's a lot of discussion around transforming economic and financial systems, and you'll be aware in New Zealand there's a bill in the House about to have its, I think, second or third reading, and it's dealing with transparency in investments that are low carbon, and it has motivated the financial systems, both the insurance sector and the banking sector, to start thinking about where and how it invests for the long term. The other issue that's gained a lot of discussion is that meeting the needs for food, water, and energy sustainability. And these are connected issues and have quite significant impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, and also on potentially how we might adapt in the future. But probably most important, this last point, is the call for working together across all these groups: international, local governments, national governments, financial, private sector, media and social networks, individuals, NGOs, science and educational organisations, but probably most importantly, communities. And communities are really at the centre of what we can do. Now, I thought I'd just give you a very quick snapshot of what has been done to date in terms of advice on low emissions future for New Zealand. And the Climate Commission, of which I'm a member, but I'm not speaking on behalf of this evening, this is in the public arena, this material. This was our advice in May, that we're not tracking to meet our targets currently. And so we said to government, we have to do better, and we need an emissions plan to meet the budgets that we set. And the budgets we set, they are ambitious and over the 3 budget periods. They're achievable, and they have been developed to be equitable. In other words, not leaving people behind. They're enduring in that they are affordable, and the transformational and lasting change is necessary, but it's possible. But while doing all of this, it must be fair, inclusive and equitable, including for iwi Māori. So these were the sort of areas that we had to address in making the advice to government, because you can't just turn a switch and suddenly have everything happen at once. And you had to have something that was achievable and that could build the building blocks for deeper cuts in the next budget periods. So there was advice across all the sectors in that top right column: agriculture, forestry, heat industry, power, transport and waste. And we considered the following issues: the pace of change by each sector and each greenhouse gas, and the potential impacts of making adjustments in a transition. We had to consider how much the emissions trading system could actually motivate change, and the role that carbon sequestration could take. Also the role that offshore mitigation could take, in other words, investing in verifiable emission reductions in other countries, and New Zealand playing its global fair share. So as you can see, it's quite a balancing act. And we put out several pathways that could achieve that, and that has gone to the government, who's now developing the emissions reduction plan. So coming back to adaptation, because if we don't achieve these reductions, or if we don't get the adjustments started, we're going to be continually in catch-up mode. And that has not been helped by the fact that we've had 30 years of relative inaction, and some particular and unique New Zealand issues around forestry, where we haven't had the replanting rates that were projected back when the emissions trading system was first set up. So the sooner we get the emissions down, the lesser the amount of adaptation we will have to do. And I've mentioned the lag time in the biophysical world and the oceans, which will mean that these are ongoing impacts that we'll have to adjust to. And this means for some risks, transformational change are going to be necessary. And I think if you just think for a minute about that video, the adjustments that can be made, for instance, in land use change, are probably relatively easy compared with the sort of adjustments that are going to have to be made as sea level rise advances, where people's houses, properties, and the rest of it are going to have to be moved or abandoned. And we have some choices now that can be made to not increase the amount of exposure we have in those coastal areas. And we develop options, and we need to look at how those might be, what that range of options are, and see how sensitive they are to the different futures that NIWA video showed, and also how they impact on different groups of people. And in doing that, communities are going to be able to develop plans for reducing those exposures and also looking after the most vulnerable in the process. So I think this is my final slide. It really needs a mind shift, a paradigm shift, because we're doing this for our mokopuna, our grandchildren. And we've recently seen publicity around what a world will look like for those children who are being born today. And unless we do this shift urgently, there's going to be a huge burden pushed forward to the next generation. And one of those is that we need to shift from being reactive to these extreme events that come along and be proactive and do adaptation ahead of the damage that we know is coming. And this involves doing risk assessments to reduce those risks and avoid and reduce the impacts and not make them worse, and develop a range of options and different pathways for getting to the future. And these are all things that can be done in community conversations, and there are tools to help doing that. And they're means of bringing people together to think about a collective response to the future. And we don't know yet what the RMA reforms are going to be, but there is a good chance that there'll be opportunities for more strategic planning and prioritising where those areas are that we want to avoid risk in the future, and really putting communities at the heart of the emission reductions and adaptation agenda. So I'm sorry that's a bit doom and gloom, but there is an opportunity here for communities such as your own to have these conversations about, where these risks are in the Wairarapa, what they want to see in the future, and how they can actually develop a plan to get there. So I'll stop there, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I can see where the sort of questions you have, and somebody's going to moderate those questions.
Good, thank you, Judy, for that talk. And so now it's time for questions. So whether you want to put your hand up or put a comment in there, we do have one already from Robin, which is how much is the Three Waters proposal informed or driven by climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was going to actually put that whole issue up on the screen, but I thought, well, maybe it'll come up in conversation. But I think it's largely driven, as I understand it, by efficiency gains and costs of replacing the infrastructure deficit. That's the primary push, as I understand it. The question is that provides a huge opportunity to factor climate change into the decision making. And I mean, I don't have a view on the exactly what's proposed. I haven't followed it as closely as I'm sure some of you have. But it certainly provides a huge opportunity to make sure that the investments that will be made are in the right places and they deliver avoidance of further damage from climate change in the future.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Yep.
Go for it, John.
Oh, right. Thank you. I'll start with an observation. Whatever we do to reduce per capita emissions, the difficulty is that we have an ever-increasing number of people. So I just make that observation. But the main thing I wanted to say was that you mentioned that the government is working on developing an emissions reduction plan. If we're working on developing a plan, that does seem to be a very long way from actually reducing our emissions. And the other thrust of perhaps not everything you've said, but a great deal of what you've said and what we hear from the Climate Change Commission gives people like me and the ordinary person in the street, I feel, the impression that this is all a problem for central and local government. And we as individuals don't really need to do anything unless we happen to be in government ourselves. We can just wait for it to happen, but I'm not sure that that's correct. You did mention just towards the very end, working at community level, and you also used, I thought, some excellent words when you said we need a mind shift, but doesn't that mind shift have to be at the individual level? I mean, I don't see the average New Zealander worrying at all about their carbon emissions. What's your comment about that?
Well, lots of questions in there, John. I think the first point, if we go to the emissions reduction plan, the government decided, for better or worse, to give the Climate Change Commission the job of advising, not deciding. Okay, that's the first point. So we work within a framework where the targets are set in the law, and we are only advisors, right? Now, that wasn't what the proposal initially was to be, but that was the politically brokered decision across government, across Parliament, to get the bill and the act over the line. Okay, so that was the political possibility. And that's what we're stuck with, actually, unless the government, and only the government and Parliament, can change the law, right? So that's the framework we work within. Having said that, nobody needs to wait until the government develops the emissions reduction plan, but the legislation mandates that. So we advise, the government then draws up the plan, and the plan then gets implemented. And if you look at from go to woe, it's quite a lengthy process. And your observation is absolutely right. The Commission has given advice that this is a collective that has to happen, a collective of individuals. Nobody can do it on their own. No one organisation can do it on its own. And no sector can do it on its own. And we've made that, and Rod Carr, our chair, has made that very clear on many occasions. And the advice we gave was that the transition to a low carbon future had to work very closely with people, and working with iwi Māori and other groups in society, and ensuring that every little bit counts. So that message gets a bit blurred because everybody views Wellington as being one amorphous thing. But the Commission has the ability to give free and frank advice to the government on request sometimes, but independently as well. But we're a small organisation, so there's a limit to what we can actually do. So yes, it's a baby step. You could look at it that way, but it's setting up a framework which has said to government that its current plans and what it's doing, meeting the targets. And we've set out a number of pathways that if they get going on the policies that are needed to put in place, then they can reach those budget targets. So it's a process really for them to make it easy for them, if you like, to meet those targets. But unfortunately, the legislation does not have sanctions. And so, but except for the reports that we give and the reasons for diverging from our advice have to be reported to Parliament. So there's a naming and shaming element to it.
My worry is that it'll be seen as a target for the government, not as a target for all New Zealanders.
Well, governments set out legislation for New Zealanders.
Well, let's hope.
That's what law is. It's not for the government. It's for the people of New Zealand, for the good of New Zealand. And that's built into the objectives of the legislation. Yeah.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you for your question. I think Robin's got a question.
Good.
A cat.
Oh, is that working?
Yeah, we see you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm hiding in the end of the house. So for my generation, so I'm a Gen X, but certainly the millennials that I talk to, climate change is at the forefront of their thinking, to the point where some of those people that are choosing not to have children, because they understand the gravity of what's happening. So I think the younger generations, this is going to have a huge impact, and already does have a huge impact on them and their decisions. I think yes, every little bit counts. I'm going to agree with that. So I've studied climate change at Vic, and I'm just wondering, communication-wise, how do we get the message out to not just New Zealand but the Wairarapa about how serious this is? Is there having meetings like this is great, but how do you get the information out to the general public who may have the opinion that this is the government's problem or big business's problem? How do you get that out there and get people talking about it? Because unless people talk about it in a rational way, then they're not going to be armed with the information they need to make change. So do you have an idea about how we should do that?
Yeah, no, that's good. We've got an example in the Hutt city that I live in, and where the local community board convened a series of meetings on climate change. And some of the exercises that I'd helped develop with some colleagues were taken, and the Petone people did this as well, and ran little workshops where they were given the job of developing an adaptation plan and looking at different options and different ways of addressing them. And so what you do need, though, are people who can lead that process and can motivate people, and it can be young people can do it, or it can be anyone who has the skills to facilitate and lead those sorts of conversations. But I've got examples all around New Zealand now where those sorts of community conversations are occurring, and they're amongst, farming groups, mixed groups of sectors. They're amongst people living in cities and towns. And I think what's happening is a growing awareness, mainly coming from the young people, as you say, and motivating those sorts of conversations. It's in the media, in duplicate, triplicate, every day. It's right in front of people. And so the question is having the right resources, having the right facilitators, getting people together in small groups, having those conversations, and that sort of thing can be multiplied across the community. So that's just one example. But there are, your communities and what works, and there's information that can be made available to have those conversations.
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Hi, Vern.
Hi. Do you have a view on having a separate budget for short-lived gases and long-lived gases, and also on carbon offsetting within New Zealand and using offshore offsetting at some point?
Yeah, maybe we go to the last one first. One of the issues with offsetting offshore is verifiability. And so the Commission took the view that we wanted to see permanent reductions as a priority. So that was permanent emission reductions from both methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. And we have, for better or worse, we have a split gas target, right? And so we have to work with that. And so that and that is a signal that both lots of emissions need to be all emissions need to be coming down, okay? Because they do influence near-term warming and long-term warming. And so if we move fast on the short-lived gases, then that's going to provide a little bit of breathing space, if you like, to get some of the long-term intractable emission reductions down, like particularly in the transport sector, where the biggest increases occurred recently. So the second part of that conversation around offshore and domestic is that we have much more confidence in domestic reductions because we can see them and measure them mostly. And of course, the farmers are working out ways how to do that as we speak. And we also made quite a big shift in the recommendations around forestry, that we wanted to see some fast-growing forests to tide us over, but have permanent forests and preferably Indigenous forests for the long term. And this comes back to the sort of signalling that's coming from UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and also other biodiversity people, where we've lost so much of our biodiversity. And New Zealand is a classic case, that building up our Indigenous forest estate and protecting what's there through invasive species and so on is part of the long-term solution. So, yeah. So I don't know whether that answers all. Was there something else there, Vern, that I haven't answered?
No, I think that covers it. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Now, I think Linton was next, or someone else who had their hand up.
Yeah. I got my hand up there. Just running, because a lot of talk, we're talking about kind of infrastructure and things that have long impacts. Is there a place for like the government to step into in the private sphere? Like I was listening to the radio about Wellington Airport expansion, and like to make. It was someone who was saying, that in one part the council who part owns it is saying we're in a climate crisis, but then they're also supporting the increase in the size of the airport. And like, is there a point where the government says, no, we're not going to follow this path, and just because they have, it's an infrastructure that's for tens or hundreds of years invested, that they make, calls and shut down things in the private sphere?
Yeah. Well, the whole question of aviation has not really been focused on very closely, and it's one of the things that may well be pushed the way of the Climate Commission to look at for the future. But globally, there are some quite large innovations occurring for increased proportion of biofuels in aviation. So there are longer term going to be some quite big shifts, I think, in the sort of fuel use of aeroplanes and other means of moving goods and services around, drones and so forth. So that is a more longer term issue that's going to be developed. But coming back to the issue of government intervention, we don't know what is going to be in the emissions reduction plan, but there are some very big questions around what we're investing in at the moment. And I think if you looked at the COVID investments that were made, some of those were not climate friendly at all. And the one that really stuck out for me, and which I think might be of interest to the Wairarapa, is that, and it wasn't in the Wairarapa, it was in the Manawatu, was the identification of an area for further urban development through the investment of stop banks. Now, you don't have to stop and think for too long to realise the contradiction in that, when the investments, if they were to last, one would have thought that you would want to be building houses on elevated land and not have to rely on flood protection works, which eventually will fail at some point and have done already in New Zealand. And so I think that I think the challenging of people's logic when they're making those decisions is a very important part of this whole process. And you know, people's mindsets have to change, but also the pressures that they get put under, particularly local councils, to build new developments. They get more rates, they get more economic activity, and et cetera, but at what cost and to whom and when? Those are the sorts of questions that really need to be asked, and they're not at the moment sufficiently to be able to start reducing the impacts of climate change. So as far as interventions concerned in airports and so on, one has to be, I couldn't speak for the government at all. I wouldn't know whether that's what they would be looking at, but I think challenging the logic of some of those decisions, and we've seen that just, you know, in the last year, more and more people are questioning these decisions. So hopefully that will snowball.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can I ask a question, Judy? Ian Gunn here.
Hi.
Hi. When you make these forecasts and things, how much do you look at what's going on in the rest of the world? So, for example, fermentation process advancements, EV rapidly growing, and how do you look at that?
Yeah, we do, and we did. We made a decision that the budgets would be based on known technology, because we were wanting something to happen. We didn't want to be giving advice that would delay action, because we've had 30 years of waiting for technologies, and they haven't. Not many of them have actually borne fruit yet. Some are close to it in the agriculture sector, but we've been waiting a long time. I've been involved in this climate change stuff for quite some decades, and we've been waiting for those technologies for quite some time, and they have not yet come to market. So, but answering your question directly, yes, the overseas developments are looked at. The Commission has a research, we develop evidence base to make these decisions, and we're following some of those new technologies quite closely.
Because things like the fermentation process advances has a big impact on the Wairarapa in terms of agriculture. Right.
And so what, you're interested in capitalising on that, or is that what you're...
I'm no entrepreneur. I just... we have to put things in context, I think, is what I'm trying to say. And, when you look back on your life and I look back on my life, things that have happened, we never thought they would happen.
Yeah, sure.
You know, I worked in the water area in Greater Wellington Regional Council, and we didn't see the nitrates and the phosphates appearing in the water. And so it's actually seeing those things which are developing, good decisions about it.
Yeah. Well, I just have to trade a little anecdote, Ian. I did the first environment strategy for the dairy industry, and that was back in the 90s, and that was anticipated and it was known. So, you know, the question is, we're blind to some of these things as well. We're blind to some of the possibilities of what may happen. And I think we do need to open up our minds to thinking about what can we do now that can actually make a big difference and provide a platform from which we can actually make these, which will be bigger emission cuts in the future and will mean big investments in adaptation one way or another. So, yeah. Anyway, I think Anna's got a question as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, given your long history and your long time in being involved with this stuff and looking at the global situation, do you feel, you and your colleagues at the Climate Commission, do you feel hopeful? You know, give us a out of 10. How hopeful do you feel?
Well, I can't speak for the Commission. I'm here in my own capacity, but I have days where I have hope and I have days where I'm deeply depressed about the whole thing. So, but I think the trick is that we have to do something. We have to act. And that means making choices as individuals and as a collective. And the more we can support each other, you know, when doing these things, whether it be the way we grow our food, how many trips to the supermarket we make, whether we drive there or take the bus, you know, all those sorts of decisions, we have to support each other in doing, because they're hard. They're quite big shifts in the way we have to live our lives. So, you know, none of us is perfect. So, you know, I wouldn't be working on this if I had a bit of hope. So, yeah, a lot of time invested in actually getting the messaging and getting the information in the right place for people to make decisions. It's pretty important. Thanks for your question, Anna.
Can I ask another question? And that's, how can we support the Climate Commission?
Oh, well, I think taking action locally in communities and working with your councils and your local decision makers and your, you know, your sectors and pulling that together in a local sense, I think is extremely important. You know, I've got another example, which I got myself involved in one summer, which was, there was a group in Marlborough who set themselves up as a climate change group, essentially. And there are a number of these around the country. There's a very active one in Nelson as well. But this group in Marlborough asked myself and James Renwick from Victoria University as well to go over and support them at a hearing with the council on their Marlborough environment plan, which we did. And they had put together a submission which actually made a suggestion to the council as a way of working together as a community with them as the plan was being developed and also for its implementation. And interestingly enough, to my surprise, the council agreed, and there was provision made in the decisions on the plan to involve that group directly. And it wasn't exactly a citizen science group, but it was more of a forum that the council could work with as they were implementing their policies. And so that group's been very active. Other groups haven't been quite so successful working with councils, but I was involved in the coastal hazards strategy that was set up in the Hawke's Bay, which I'm sure you've probably heard about. And that involved a series of panels over a period of about 18 months, working with the council to develop future pathways and options for adaptation at the coast. And while it hasn't been implemented yet, they've got a strategy agreed between 3 councils who historically have never agreed with each other, as I'm sure you're aware. And those councils finally did come to an agreement to develop the plans for implementation. But the biggest stumbling block was finance and who would pay. Finally, they got an ex-judge to adjudicate, and that judge decided that the regional council would set up the system and collect the rates to pay for the implementation. And, you know, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating in terms of how, once they get to actually making some decisions to implement, as to whether or not that the money comes from the other councils. But I think it shows what can be done in a region or in a greater area where you've got a number of councils, and finding a way of working. And what was critical in that process was the leadership. There was a regional councillor, Peter Bevan, who I don't know if you know, he was an excellent facilitator. And they've got another person now who took on the role. And I've been to meetings more recently, and they're really going along very well. And the community are now taking the initiative to lead the process and to communicate and work with their communities more broadly. And having been involved over the, you know, quite a lengthy period of time in that exercise, last 3 years really, 3 or 4 years, I've watched how the community went from being very angry with the council, not trusting the council, to now being a group of people who are prepared to work with the council in a very sort of collaborative way, and going out and working with their communities. But it's a long-term process, you know. Building trust is probably at the heart of these sorts of processes, and leadership.
Thank you, Judy.
Okay.
There's just a couple of, I don't know if you want to finish, a couple of quick comments that were in the chat about why was aviation not included in the Climate Commission's brief, and then one other about painting our roofs white. Will that help compensate for that? Right.
Well, it is potential. It is in our brief, but it's not now. Just not at the moment. Okay, that's aviation. So we'll get to it. And albedo, painting it white. Well, I think it would keep you cooler in the summer. But I think in terms of the impact of that, it's probably fairly small in the scheme of things. Yeah, that's probably all I can say on that one. So we've got another one here from Chris.
We'll finish on this one.
That one? Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have it in the yeah, that's an interesting question.
Just to interrupt, Judy, could you read Chris's question out?
Oh, can you not see it there? Can you turn on your chat?
I turn that on, do I? Thanks.
Yeah, just click the
I got
chat.
it. Okay.
Pop up.
Yep. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think your statement's moot would be my in terms of the reducing of emissions requiring stable climate-dependent energy sources. I presume you're talking about wind and solar.
Yeah.
Is that right, Chris?
Yes. Well, and hydro.
Sorry?
And hydro.
And hydro, yeah. And you know, hydro has typically large amounts of cement. So, I mean, I haven't done the comparisons. I don't know whether you have, in terms of the embodied energy and the whole energy, the amount of CO2 in either of those. areas. But one of the things we have noticed, and certainly in the work that my research, is that there is quite a big potential for emission reductions to make adaptation more difficult, and adaptation decisions to increase CO2 particularly. So, well, yeah, and other some other greenhouse gases. So it's a live discussion actually about the degree to which those two cancel each other out. I mean, you could take irrigation, for example. Irrigation uses high energy. If it's used in drought-prone areas, where the impacts of climate change are going to, impact significantly, there'll become a time when water runs out, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so, some people say that irrigation in areas that are becoming more droughty is a maladaptation or an adaptation that's going to cause problems downstream. So yeah, that's certainly an issue that's being discussed, and I don't think it's one that has probably had enough attention. So
So I asked the question because I'm on the local council climate change focus group.
Okay.
And this is a dilemma that we're looking at a regional level and also at an individual level. It comes to individual decision making about whether you buy an electric vehicle or not.
Sure.
Because if you're living in a rural community and power goes out for a couple of days, you're stuffed, and you want your petrol generator, you want your backup SUV so you can carry on with your life. And so when you're making individual decisions, yes, you want to do something that's good for the planet, but you also want to be able to be secure in your environment. So yeah,
I think those are issues that we put in the basket of transitional issues. If we're transitioning to a low carbon economy, there are going to be a lot of issues like that, and they're going to be lumpy and they're going to be messy. And I think we just, it's not going to just happen overnight. As I said before, you can't just switch us on to doing something else. People have to shift their minds, and the systems have to be in place so that there are backups that are climate resilient. So, but you're right to raise it, because it means that, we're having a conversation about the need to have these other backup systems as we're transitioning to a low carbon future. So they're very important questions.
Thanks.
So thank you, Judy, for coming or offering to come to the Wairarapa, but at least zooming into us and sharing a bit about your work and what you've been learning and about what we need to be doing. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I wish you well, and I'll pop over the hills when we get to level 1 and have a bit of a holiday and a tramp in the hills or something.
I think Chris has something to say.
Yeah. No, sorry, I've still got my hand up.
Oh, Chris. Yeah, hi.
Kia ora, Judy. That was just marvellous, and huge amount of food for thought. But I take your point that in the end, we need to develop a community response, and where we need to be talking to each other. And I think that comes down to local leadership, and it means that whatever industry and whatever our thoughts are at the moment, we need to be able to put those aside and come and listen to people who whose initial ideas may be different from ours, and we need to be talking to each other to come to because there's huge uncertainty, and none of us have got the answers here, and it will change. But I think we will be the stronger by being more forward looking. I always remember that quotation from McLuhan that you can't drive into the future with your eyes on the rear vision mirror.
That's right. That's right. And we have to find solutions. We can't be talking about problems all the time.
No, that's right. And so there's lots of ideas of adaptive management and all that sort of stuff. But so thank you very much. And I hope that we'll be able to get you over to talk to our combined council meetings at some stage. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Oh, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all, and good luck.
And maybe if we all unmute, we could do a round of applause.
Oh, you can actually do it online. I'll show you. Okay. Cheers now.
Judy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linton.
No worries, it worked.
It did.